On the afternoon of 26th of March, 1883, in the brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, New York, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor sat beneath a high gas chandelier, a small leather address book open on her lap. Outside, carriage wheels grind on late winter slush. Across the avenue rises the marble bulk of A.T. Stewart's palace, a reminder that even old families now have rivals. Gloved in pale kid leather, she pauses over a name. Her maid has just brought in the evening papers, crowded with speculation about Alva Vanderbilt's masquerade ball to be held tonight at 660 Fifth Avenue. The ball of the decade, one society writer will later call it, a spectacle that even Mrs. Astor cannot ignore. Caroline adjusts the edge of her glove, then writes, in neat, practiced script, Mrs. W. K. Vanderbilt, into her visiting list. A single social call will open a door for the Vanderbilts and quietly redraw the map of New York power. In that small motion of pen and glove lies the hidden cost of her reign, lives measured in ink on paper and in those left unwritten. By the early autumn of 1830, at West Greenwich Street in Lower Manhattan, the infant Carolyn Webster Schermerhorn is introduced into a world already shaped for her arrival. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, has built substantial wealth through shipping and mercantile ventures, establishing the family among New York's prosperous merchant class. Her mother, Helen Van Cortlandt White, brings Dutch colonial ancestry from both the Schermerhorn and Van Cortlandt lines, names that trace back to New Amsterdam, to families who held land and influence before the Revolution. The infant's christening at the Reformed Dutch Church connects her to congregations her ancestors helped found, embedding her in networks of kinship and commerce that have organized Manhattan's elite since the 17th century. Birth announcements in city papers place her within a specific stratum. Not the very wealthiest families, but solidly among those who matter, who attend the right churches, whose daughters will be introduced into the right circles. As Manhattan surges northward through the 1830s and 1840s, the city's population swelling with immigrants, new fortunes emerging from manufacturing and finance, the Schermerhorn family moves with the respectable classes, relocating from Lower Manhattan to 36 Bond Street near Lafayette Place. This neighborhood, with its Greek Revival row houses and tree-lined streets, becomes an early enclave of genteel respectability, home to families who have begun to separate themselves from the commercial districts where their wealth originates. Here, young Caroline, called Lena by family, attends Madame Bensay's French School, an institution that caters to daughters of New York's established families. The curriculum reflects what such families believe their daughters need: fluency in French as a mark of cultivation, instruction in drawing and watercolor painting, training in music and deportment, and most fundamentally, the careful art of social poise that will allow them to move gracefully through drawing rooms and ballrooms. School records and later society references describe Lena as an able student, particularly strong in languages, demonstrating the kind of quick intelligence that serves women well in conversation, but must never appear too assertive or academic. The scratch of pen on copybook pages becomes her first ritual, practicing French phrases, copying poetry in elegant script, and notably, rehearsing the names of family, friends, and social connections as if preparing a future guest list. Archival traces preserved in family papers and historical society collections show how this education prepared daughters of merchant families for lives of reception rather than profession. They learned to be ornamental but not idle, accomplished but not ambitious, capable of managing complex households but not of seeking careers or public roles. Every skill was calibrated to a single purpose: making them suitable wives for men of their own class, women who could maintain the social position their husbands' fortunes made possible. The narrator observes that from her earliest years, privilege gave Caroline Schermerhorn a vantage point, access to education, culture, comfort, but also a narrowing role. The city around her was expanding rapidly, new possibilities opening for men of ambition and talent regardless of birth. But her path, defined by gender and class, narrowed toward one expectation: to become the woman at the door of respectable society. learning early how to recognize who belonged inside and who must remain without. On 23rd September 1853, in New York City, Caroline Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., grandson of John Jacob Astor, whose fur trading empire and subsequent real estate investments had made him America's first multimillionaire. Contemporary newspaper accounts chronicle the union as the merging of substantial Schermerhorn mercantile wealth with even greater Astor real estate fortune, old money of Dutch colonial ancestry, joining to still older money accumulated by a German immigrant who had dominated the fur trade and then systematically acquired Manhattan property. The match is advantageous for both families. The Schermerhorns gain connection to New York's wealthiest dynasty. The Astors, whose fortune is vast but whose origins remain slightly commercial, gain alliance with a family whose colonial pedigree provides social legitimacy. The marriage is not a love match in the romantic sense. Such considerations, while not entirely absent from elite marriages of the period, are secondary to questions of suitability, fortune, and family alliance. Early in their marriage, the couple divides time between various Astor properties, townhouses in Manhattan, country estates along the Hudson River, and increasingly summer residences in Newport, Rhode Island, where New York's wealthiest families are establishing a seasonal colony. Between 1854 and 1864, Caroline gave birth to 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son, occupying herself with the nursery and household management that consume wealthy women's time and energy during these years. Society columns from the 1850s and 1860s preserved in newspaper archives describe Caroline's appearances as dutiful rather than dazzling. She attends the opera, receives callers on proper afternoons, appears at benefits for approved charities, the standard round of activities expected of Astor women. She is, like many women of her class and generation, primarily occupied with domestic concerns rather than social leadership, focused on raising children and managing the complex household apparatus of servants, schedules, and supplies. Yet within this conventional frame, a social instinct begins sharpening. The ritual of calling, the elaborate system by which wealthy women maintain connections through formal visits, becomes for Caroline a kind of apprenticeship in social management. Calling cards are exchanged, visits returned on prescribed afternoons according to intricate protocols. She begins keeping a more systematic visiting book, pages ruled into columns for names, addresses, dates of calls made and returned. On a winter afternoon in her parlor, light filtering through lace curtains, Caroline sits at a small writing desk reviewing her visiting book. Her gloved hand moves down the columns, pausing at certain names. When a family has failed to return a call within the socially prescribed time frame, she draws a small line through their entry, not erasing them, but marking them as having failed to observe proper forms. The gesture is minute but consequential. Those who do not maintain the rituals of calling find themselves gradually excluded from invitation lists, removed from the circuits of social connection. The narrator reflects that marriage elevated Caroline Schermerhorn into the Astor dynasty, giving her access to wealth and position far beyond what her own family's fortune would have provided. But it also handed her a new instrument, an emerging social network that could be documented, analyzed, and increasingly controlled. The visiting book in her lap is not merely a record of social activity, but a tool for shaping that activity, for determining whose names remain current and whose fade into irrelevance. By 1862, the Astors commissioned a 4-bay brownstone townhouse at 350 Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, then a fashionable residential district where wealthy families were building substantial homes along the avenue's eastern side. The house, designed in the French Second Empire style favored by New York's elite during the Civil War era, is comparatively restrained beside some of the marble palaces rising nearby. But it contains one crucial extravagance, a ballroom on the second floor large enough to accommodate several hundred guests. Contemporary descriptions and later architectural surveys document the house's layout: formal reception rooms on the parlor floor for receiving callers, family rooms on upper floors for private life, and that strategic ballroom, whose size and appointments declare the Astor's intention to entertain on a grand scale. The space becomes the physical manifestation of Caroline's growing role. No longer merely a dutiful Astor wife focused on nursery and household, she is becoming a hostess whose approval matters, whose invitations are sought. Society columns through the 1870s begin to mention Mrs. William B. Astor's Mondays, set afternoons when the Fifth Avenue house is open for reception, when the city's established families present their daughters, inspect newcomers to the social scene, and quietly compare lineages and fortunes. The gatherings follow strict protocols. Callers arrive between prescribed hours, leave cards, even if the hostess is not receiving that day. Observe rules about introduction and conversation that sort the initiated from the aspirational. Invitations to these receptions become coveted. Absence from the Astor drawing room is noted and interpreted. Families seeking to establish or maintain social position recognize that Mrs. Astor's recognition matters in ways that mere wealth cannot guarantee. New money can build marble palaces, can hire French chefs and buy opera boxes, but cannot compel Mrs. Astor to receive them. That requires something more elusive, a combination of proper behavior, acceptable connections, and Caroline's private judgment about who enhances rather than diminishes the tone of her gatherings. Here, Caroline's ritual evolves into something more systematic. Before each social season, the winter months when society congregates in New York, she sits at a small writing desk in her private sitting room, reviewing lists with Ward McAllister, the Savannah-born social arbiter who has attached himself to her circle as advisor and interpreter. Together, they discuss which names should be received, invited to Astor entertainments, and which must remain politely outside. The decisions are based on multiple factors: family background, reputation, behavior at previous social events, and intangible assessments of whether a person or family belongs. McAllister, who will later publish his memoir, Society as I Have Found It, describes these consultations as exercises in preserving standards against the tide of new wealth flooding into New York during the Gilded Age. Caroline, more pragmatic than her advisor, understands that absolute exclusion of new fortunes is impossible. The city's elite must evolve or become irrelevant, but she insists on controlling the pace and terms of that evolution, determining which families are ready for acceptance and which remain beyond the pale. Her gloved hand hovers over the pages, pen poised to add or omit names from the coming season's lists. The gesture has become weighted with power. Each name added represents validation, social, arrival, access to networks of connection and opportunity. Each name omitted represents exclusion from the world that matters, condemnation to social invisibility regardless of wealth or ambition. The narrator observes that what appears in contemporary photographs as a serene Fifth Avenue drawing room, silk-upholstered furniture, paintings in gilt frames, fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, is actually functioning as a control room, a space where one woman's judgments about worthiness and suitability are translated into the social architecture of New York's upper class. Every card placed on a silver tray downstairs by a caller has passed invisibly through Caroline Astor's private arithmetic of worth. In the winter of 1874, at the Fifth Avenue house, Caroline's eldest daughter, also named Caroline but known as Carrie within the family, rehearsed a cotillion step under the eye of a dancing master hired for the season. The girl is 16, approaching the age when she will be formally presented to society and begin attending the balls and dinners where young women of her class meet potential husbands. Her preparation for this debut has been systematic and thorough, following the educational template that governs daughters of New York's wealthiest families. Nearby in the music room, a French tutor drills younger sisters in verb conjugations, their accents corrected until they achieve the fluent pronunciation expected of cultivated young women. Down the hall, a music teacher adjusts another daughter's hand position at the piano, ensuring that her playing demonstrates both technical competence and appropriate feminine grace, accomplished enough to entertain guests, but not so professional as to suggest unseemly ambition or need for paid performance. The curriculum for Astor daughters, documented in estate account books that list payments to governesses and visiting masters. mirrors the education available at elite institutions like Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, or the French convent academies where some American heiresses are sent. The subjects are standard: French and German language, literature, and history, focused on cultural rather than political knowledge, drawing and watercolor painting, music, and crucially, the arts of deportment: how to walk, sit, stand, and move through social spaces with the effortless grace that marks proper breeding. But beyond these formal lessons lies a more subtle education in observation and judgment. Carrie and her sisters watch their mother receive callers, noting who is greeted warmly and who with cooler courtesy, learning to read the minute gradations of welcome that communicate social hierarchy. They observe which families are invited to intimate dinners versus large receptions, beginning to understand that proximity to Mrs. Astor herself is a form of favor that must be earned and can be withdrawn. At night, after the daughters have retired to their rooms, Caroline reviews their dance cards from recent evenings, the small printed cards where young men sign their names beside waltz and polka, creating a documentary record of who danced with whom. She scans these cards not for evidence of romance but for patterns of alliance, which surnames recur beside each daughter's name, which families are seeking connection with the Astors, which matches might be suitable when the time comes for more serious courtship. Her fingers straighten the edges of the cards as she examines them, the gesture at once maternal, caring about her daughter's happiness and security, and strategic, recognizing that her daughters' marriages will determine not only their individual futures, but also the position of the Astor family in coming generations. A daughter married well strengthens the family's network and prestige. A daughter married poorly, or worse, married to someone unsuitable, creates embarrassment and potential scandal that can ripple through society for years. Society columns, when they mention the young Astor women, praise their accomplishments, and deportment, the standard language for approving of elite daughters who have been properly trained. But behind these bland public notices lies intensive private work: hours of lessons, constant corrections of posture and pronunciation, the internalization of countless unwritten rules about proper behavior that distinguish the truly refined from mere pretenders. The narrator reflects that education for daughters like Carrie Astor is not preparation for profession or public life, but rehearsal for a specific kind of performance: the performance of being an elite woman worthy of an elite marriage. Every bowed head at the piano, every perfectly executed curtsy, every French phrase pronounced with Parisian precision is, quietly, an investment in the family's continued reign atop New York society. The daughters are being transformed into assets, their value measured by their ability to attract suitable husbands and maintain the family's position through their own social performances as wives and eventually mothers of the next generation. On a blustery afternoon in January 1880, carriage after carriage pulled up before 355th Avenue. Horses stamping against the cold, drivers wrapped in heavy coats waiting while their employers made brief social calls inside. The ritual unfolds with clockwork precision. A footman opens the carriage door. A lady descends holding her skirts clear of slush. Another footman opens the Astor front door, and within minutes the caller either enters for a brief visit or simply leaves a card on the silver tray before returning to her carriage. Inside the entrance hall, additional footmen in Astor livery arrange the calling cards as they accumulate, small rectangles of heavy cardstock, each engraved with a name, sometimes an address, often nothing more than Mrs. Husband's name, in elegant script. The cards are sorted by arrival time and then carried upstairs to Mrs. Astor's private sitting room, where she will review them later, deciding which calls must be returned, which are acknowledged with her own card, and which can be politely ignored. Etiquette manuals of the period, preserved in library collections and reprinted in contemporary magazines, prescribe the elaborate system that Caroline enforces with uncompromising rigor. Morning calls must occur between specific hours. Too early suggests improper eagerness. Too late indicates lack of breeding. Cards can be corner-folded in specific ways to indicate whether the caller represents herself alone or her entire family, whether the visit is social or duty-driven. Return calls must be made within a fixed number of days or the social debt remains outstanding, creating awkwardness at future encounters. Newspapers record which receptions the Mrs. Astor has honored with her presence and which she has quietly ignored, using her attendance or absence as signals of approval or disapproval that the city's social arbiters read carefully. When Mrs. Astor attends an entertainment, she validates it. When she declines, others take note and adjust their own plans accordingly. Her presence or absence can make or break a hostess's reputation, determine whether a family is accepted, or remains perpetually on society's margins. Carolyn's evening ritual sharpens during these years. After dinner, she retires to her sitting room where the day's accumulated cards await. In lamplight that casts soft shadows across the desk, she sorts through them, making small notations in her register beside certain names. A check mark for families to be encouraged, a question mark for those under observation, and sometimes a line drawn through a name, indicating that this family has somehow failed to meet her standards. The reasons for exclusion are rarely stated openly, but the patterns are clear from surviving correspondence and later memoirs. Families whose wealth is too recent and commercial, whose behavior at social events has been too loud or forward, whose daughters have been seen in inappropriate company, or whose sons have been involved in public scandals. Sometimes the exclusion is purely strategic, keeping away families who might challenge the Astor's preeminence, or whose inclusion would complicate existing social arrangements. A name struck through in Caroline's register is more than a personal preference or momentary annoyance. It is effectively a sentence of social invisibility. Without Mrs. Astor's recognition, a family finds invitations declining, connections cooling, the doors of the best houses closing. Wealth alone cannot overcome this exclusion. New York in the 1880s is full of millionaires whose money cannot buy them entrance to Mrs. Astor's ballroom, who build ever grander houses and throw ever more lavish entertainments in hopes of attracting her notice. The narrator observes that, seen from above, from the perspective of contemporary journalists or later historians, the calling system resembles an elaborate dance of carriages and cards, a quaint Victorian ritual of social maintenance. But seen from within, from the perspective of those seeking admission or fearing exclusion, it is a series of doors that can close with a single gloved gesture. Mrs. Astor's hand drawing a line through a name, her decision not to return a call, her absence from an event signaling judgment more powerful than any explicit condemnation. By the early 1880s, the Astor's Newport cottage, Beechwood, had been substantially remodeled by architect Richard Morris Hunt to accommodate Carolyn's expanding social role. The house, set on several acres along Bellevue Avenue, in the heart of Newport's developing summer colony, now includes a grand ballroom that can hold several hundred guests, elaborate gardens suitable for afternoon teas and garden parties, and reception rooms designed to display both the family's wealth and Caroline's increasingly refined taste. Contemporary accounts from Newport newspapers and society magazines describe Beechwood as the informal summer capital of New York society during these years. On humid July and August evenings, when waves roll faintly beyond the clipped lawn and ocean breezes provide relief from the day's heat, carriages arrive bearing guests dressed in elaborate evening costume, women in silk and satin despite the warmth, men in formal dinner dress, everyone performing the rituals of elegance regardless of practical comfort. Mrs. Astor's dinners and musical sales set the rhythm of the Newport season. Her schedule, published in advance through discreet channels, determines when other hostesses may plan their own entertainments. No one of ambition schedules an event that conflicts with an Astor gathering, and those who do find their parties poorly attended. The competition for invitations becomes intense during the summer months when society is concentrated in the relatively small space of Newport's cottage colony, making inclusion or exclusion more visible and consequential than during the dispersed winter season in New York. The ballroom at Beechwood, according to sources from the period, can comfortably accommodate approximately 400 people, a practical fact relating to the room's physical dimensions and fire safety considerations. but a number that will soon take on ideological weight as the supposed natural limit of true society. This capacity represents not just architectural constraint, but Caroline's vision of society's proper size, large enough to include all legitimately belonging families, small enough to maintain exclusivity and coherence. In a small sitting room off the main hall, removed from the public spaces where guests gather, Caroline reviews guest lists for upcoming entertainments. Evening light filters through curtains, fountain pen poised over thick paper, as she considers each name. She hesitates over certain entries. Families whose wealth is substantial but whose origins remain too commercial, whose behavior has been mostly acceptable but not quite impeccable. After deliberation informed by conversations with Ward McAllister and observations from previous seasons, she adds some names, omits others. Outside, the sound of Atlantic waves breaking on rocky shore mingles with the rustle of silk as her daughters descend the main staircase, dressed for dinner, their deportment reflecting years of training. They move through the house with practiced grace, greeting guests with the correct degree of warmth, their conversations touching on acceptable topics, their laughter appropriately restrained. They are performing the role their education prepared them for, demonstrating that they are worthy products of Astor cultivation. Newport's concentrated social world makes Caroline's power more visible and more consequential than in New York. Here, with society's leading families living within a few miles of each other, attending the same church services and shopping on the same streets, inclusion or exclusion from the Astor Circle is impossible to hide. Those invited to Beechwood can be seen arriving by carriage, can mention casually where they spent the previous evening, can describe the entertainments they witnessed. Those excluded must find other ways to occupy their time, must explain their absence from the season's most significant events, must watch from outside as others enjoy the validation of Mrs. Astor's approval. The narrator reflects that Beechwood's sea breezes and ocean views suggest leisure and escape, summer as relief from the structured formality of winter society. But the real work of summer happens at Caroline's desk, in those quiet moments when she reviews names and makes decisions about guest lists. Inclusion in that ballroom, or absence from it, decides who belongs to the world, as insiders call it, and who remains merely wealthy, possessing money, but not the social position that money supposedly should purchase, but that Caroline's approval alone can confer. The architecture of the house mirrors the architecture of Caroline's social system. Public spaces designed for display and performance, private spaces where decisions are made away from observation, and that crucial ballroom whose capacity of 400 becomes not just a physical limitation, but a symbolic boundary separating those who matter from those who, despite their wealth, remain outside the magic circle. In February 1892, New York newspaper readers, opening the New York World, encountered an article by Ward McAllister that would permanently alter the language of American society. There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, McAllister declares, offering this precise number as both description and prescription of society's proper limits. He connects the figure explicitly to Mrs. Astor's ballroom capacity, suggesting that the physical space available for entertainment also represents the natural boundary of the social elite. The phrase, the 400, enters common usage almost immediately, seized upon by newspapers, repeated in conversations, debated in editorial pages across the country. Lists purporting to name the actual 400 begin circulating, some compiled by society insiders with genuine knowledge, others speculative attempts by journalists and social climbers trying to determine who McAllister and Mrs. Astor consider worthy of inclusion. The number becomes a cultural phenomenon, shorthand for New York's social elite, the supposedly fixed boundary between true society and mere wealth. McAllister's memoir, Society as I Have Found It, published that same year, expands on the 400 concept, arguing that society must be limited to maintain its standards and coherence. He dismisses critics who suggest that the boundary is arbitrary or unjust, insisting that true refinement requires both breeding and training, that new money needs time and proper education before it can participate appropriately in society's rituals. His language is unapologetically elitist, defending exclusion as necessary to prevent dilution of standards, to protect established families from being overwhelmed by the tide of new fortunes flowing into New York. At 350 Fifth Avenue, Caroline reads McAllister's article by lamplight, adjusting the fingers of her glove, a habitual gesture when considering something significant, before turning the page. She has not authorized the article explicitly, but neither has she discouraged her advisor from making public what has long been their private practice. The list makes visible what Caroline has been enforcing through invitation and exclusion for years: the belief that society has natural limits, that not everyone with money deserves admission, that maintenance of standards requires active gatekeeping. Publicly, Caroline neither confirms nor denies the specific list of 400 names that McAllister circulates. She maintains her characteristic discretion, allowing the speculation to swirl without adding her own commentary. But privately, in her sitting room, her visiting book already reflects the principle McAllister has articulated: pages filled with familiar names, very few additions season after season, careful notations beside families under consideration for possible inclusion but not yet fully accepted. The 400 concept generates immediate controversy. Critics note that the number is arbitrary, that society's composition changes over time, that McAllister himself is a relative newcomer from Georgia playing at being aristocratic arbiter. Newspapers in western cities and smaller towns mock the whole idea as New York snobbery, proof of the Eastern elite's disconnection from American democratic values. Even within New York, some wealthy families excluded from McAllister's list protest publicly or complain privately about the presumption of anyone claiming to define society's boundaries. But the criticism also validates the 400's power. By arguing against the list, by seeking inclusion, or defending their exclusion, families acknowledge that the boundary matters, that Mrs. Astor's approval and McAllister's recognition carry weight. The very intensity of the debate confirms what Caroline has long understood: that in a city and country where formal titles do not exist, where democracy officially rejects hereditary hierarchy, the ability to define who belongs to society represents a form of power that money alone cannot command. The narrator observes that a single newspaper column transforms Caroline Astor's unspoken practice into explicit doctrine, giving name and number to what had been an informal but effective system of inclusion and exclusion. What was once her private calculation, conducted at her desk with visiting book and pen, decisions made in consultation with McAllister but rarely explained or defended publicly, becomes, briefly, the most discussed and controversial statistic in American social life, a number that attempts to quantify the unquantifiable, to draw a bright line where Caroline has long maintained a carefully managed boundary of graduated access and acceptance. On the morning of 26th of March, 1883, the date that frames our opening portrait, a small drama plays out between two Fifth Avenue mansions, a drama that, despite its private nature, will become embedded in Gilded Age legend. Caroline's daughter, Carrie, has been rehearsing for weeks to participate in an elaborate quadrille being organized for Alva Vanderbilt's costume ball that evening. The ball has been anticipated for months, promises to be the most spectacular social event of the season, perhaps of the decade. Yet no invitation has arrived for the Astor women. The reason is strictly procedural, rooted in the elaborate etiquette that governs relations between society and women. Alva Vanderbilt, despite her wealth and the magnificence of her new mansion at 1660 Fifth Avenue, has not yet been formally received by Mrs. Astor. Social protocol requires that the older, more established lady must call first on the younger newcomer before any exchange of invitations can properly occur. Alva, keenly aware of these rules and reportedly quite strategic in her application of them, will not risk the presumption of inviting Mrs. Astor to her home without first receiving Mrs. Astor's card. This creates an impasse. Carrie desperately wants to participate in the ball and its elaborate entertainments, but her mother has not yet acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt socially. Contemporary accounts and later biographies describe how Caroline, recognizing both her daughter's disappointment and the shifting reality that Vanderbilt wealth and ambition cannot be ignored indefinitely finally makes the necessary concession. She instructs her footman to deliver her calling card to the Vanderbilt mansion, the minimal gesture required by protocol to indicate that she now considers Mrs. Vanderbilt a social equal worthy of acknowledgement. An invitation for the ball arrives swiftly at the Astor household, Alva having waited for precisely this signal before including the most prominent family in New York society on her guest list. That evening, the Astor women attend what newspapers will indeed call the Ball of the Century, and Caroline's presence validates the event in ways no amount of money or spectacular decoration could accomplish alone. By attending, Mrs. Astor confirms that the Vanderbilts have arrived socially, that railroad wealth has successfully purchased admission to the highest ranks. The incident, seemingly minor, one calling card delivered, one invitation accepted, actually represents a significant moment in Caroline Astor's reign. For years, she has used her control over recognition and invitation to regulate society's boundaries, to slow the influx of new money, to maintain the dominance of established families like her own. But the Vanderbilt ball demonstrates that her power has limits, that her approval, while still valuable, can be forced by circumstance rather than freely given. She must acknowledge Alva or risk seeming irrelevant, must attend the ball or cede social leadership to a rival hostess. Her ritual, for once, reverses. Instead of deciding who may enter her house, she must petition, through the formal mechanism of the calling card, to enter another woman's house. The gloved hand that has excluded so many places a card in her footman's tray, not an equal exchange of social courtesies between peers, but a concession that opens the door for an entire dynasty of railroad wealth that has been waiting impatiently for this moment of recognition. The narrator reflects that Caroline Astor's social power has always depended on controlling access to her own spaces and approval. But Alva Vanderbilt's strategy reveals that power's vulnerability. When someone else builds an equally or more magnificent house, stages a ball that becomes the season's central event, Mrs. Astor's choice becomes to attend and validate or abstain and risk obsolescence. To maintain her position as arbiter, Caroline must sometimes acknowledge that the architecture of privilege can be renovated from below, that new money sufficiently ambitious and strategic can purchase admission to circles that once seemed permanently closed. The card she sends that March morning is a minor object, a few inches of engraved pasteboard, but it represents a major strategic retreat, a recognition that even Mrs. Astor's formidable control over New York society cannot indefinitely exclude families with Vanderbilt wealth and determination. The gesture preserves her position for now, but it also marks the beginning of a long, slow decline in her absolute authority over society's composition and boundaries. In the late 1880s, as transatlantic dollar princess marriages multiplied, American heiresses trading family fortunes for British and European titles, Caroline Astor's Fifth Avenue drawing room functions as one of several staging grounds where such alliances are initiated and negotiated. While families like the Vanderbilts, Goulds, and Whitneys directly pursue noble connections abroad, Mrs. Astor concerns herself with a more domestic but equally consequential form of matrimonial architecture, determining which New York families should ally through marriage, whose daughters and sons should be brought together through carefully curated social events. The marriage market operates with brutal efficiency in Caroline's world, though its mechanisms remain polite and indirect. At dinners and balls, she determines seating arrangements that place certain young people beside each other, creating opportunities for conversation and connection. She grants permission for second dances between the same partners, a signal that the attachment is acceptable to her, or ensures that promising connections are not repeated, quietly communicating disapproval. Through garden parties and smaller gatherings, she brings specific families into close contact, facilitating the private conversations between fathers that precede formal courtship. Letters between parents of eligible children, preserved in various family archives, discuss suitability in explicit terms, ancestry and bloodlines, fortune and prospects, character and reputation. The language of romantic feeling appears but cautiously, surrounded by more practical assessments. These are business negotiations with human variables, alliances designed to strengthen both families' positions, consolidate fortunes, and maintain the social structure that privileges families like the Astors. In Caroline's private papers, the visiting book and correspondence that document her social activities, small symbols appear beside certain names: a notation by a promising bachelor, a mark next to a daughter whose debut has been particularly successful, comments about compatibility or concerning behaviors that might make a match inadvisable. Her gloves lie folded beside the inkstand, set aside while she records these observations, while she constructs the network of alliances that will organize the next generation. The narrator reflects that marriage in Caroline Astor's world is less about romance, though affection may develop, than about architectural balance, joining fortunes and lineages and social positions in combinations that strengthen the edifice of society itself. The human cost of these calculations rarely appears in newspaper wedding announcements or society columns, but it exists nonetheless. Young women constrained to marry within narrow circles, love interests dismissed as unsuitable, individual desires subordinated to family strategy. Mrs. Astor's careful notations represent lives being directed toward predetermined outcomes, futures shaped by considerations of family prestige rather than personal preference. In 1889, according to later biographical accounts and family histories, Caroline's niece, Margaret Laura Astor, attempts to leave a violent marriage to Hugh Dixon, a Scottish businessman whose treatment of his wife has become unbearable. The details are fragmentary. Victorian propriety and family privacy ensure that most evidence of domestic abuse remains hidden or destroyed. But surviving references in letters and memoirs describe a young woman desperate to escape a dangerous situation, seeking support from her prominent relatives. Family narratives suggest that Mrs. Astor, confronted with her niece's plea, responds not with protection, but with pressure to maintain appearances. The horror of public scandal, of divorce proceedings that would expose private violence and family dysfunction, outweighs concern for Margaret's safety and well-being. Caroline allegedly urges her to return to her husband, to endure rather than expose, to prioritize the family's reputation over her own security. The documentary evidence remains limited. References to difficulties in family correspondence, insistence on duty and endurance, terse mentions in later memoirs written by those peripheral to the immediate situation. But the pattern aligns with broader Victorian norms, documented across many upper-class families, in which women were routinely urged to tolerate abuse rather than create scandal through separation or divorce. The preservation of respectability, maintaining the appearance of harmonious families, took precedence over women's safety. Here, Caroline's ritual of social management takes a darker turn. Instead of merely excluding unsuitable families from her guest list, she allegedly insists that her niece's married name remain in use, that invitations should still read Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Dixon, that the fiction of a successful marriage must be maintained regardless of the reality behind closed doors. The ink that fixes names in visiting books now fixes a reality that actively harms the woman living beneath that formally correct identity. The narrator observes that in defending the edifice of respectability that her social system requires, Mrs. Astor may have protected the public face of her class, its image of propriety and order, while quietly abandoning one of its most vulnerable members to the same architecture. The case suggests that Caroline's power, so effectively deployed to control who enters society's upper ranks, fails when applied to protecting those already inside from private violence that threatens the facade of elite domestic harmony. By 1893, tensions within the extended Astor clan erupted not in private correspondence but in brick, stone, and public spectacle. William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew by marriage and son of the late John Jacob Astor III, has long resented that she, rather than his own deceased mother, holds the coveted title Mrs. Astor, the definite article signaling undisputed social supremacy. After years of frustrated ambition and failed attempts to establish his own wife as the legitimate bearer of the title, William Waldorf makes a dramatic gesture. He tears down his mansion at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 33rd Street, directly adjacent to Caroline's brownstone, and commissions the Grand Waldorf Hotel in its place. Contemporary newspapers treat the construction as both architectural marvel and family feud. The Waldorf, designed by architect Henry Hardenberg in the German Renaissance style, rises 13 stories, towering over Caroline's comparatively modest four-story brownstone. Guests entering the hotel's luxurious public rooms pass within sight of Mrs. Astor's windows. The hotel's dining rooms, open to anyone able to afford the prices, represent a more commercial and democratic vision of social space than Caroline's invitation-only ballroom. The symbolism is impossible to miss. William Waldorf is literally building a more modern, more accessible, more profit-oriented version of society directly next to his aunt's house. The Waldorf's paying guests need no calling cards or invitations to enter its marble lobbies and dine in its restaurants. Money alone provides admission. The hotel represents the future, commercialized, democratized, indifferent to the old protocols of calling and invitation that Caroline has enforced so rigorously. Inside 350 Fifth Avenue, Caroline attempts to maintain her normal routines: Monday receptions, seasonal balls, the careful review of calling cards and guest lists, but now the rumble of hotel delivery wagons, the voices of guests arriving and departing, the mechanical hum of the building's modern elevators leak through the walls. Her private system of controlled invitation faces a loud public rival literally next door, a building that sells for room rates what she has always granted or withheld based on judgment of family suitability. The narrator reflects that for decades Mrs. Astor used houses, her own and others, to define who belonged to society, using architecture to enforce boundaries and create hierarchies. With the Waldorf's opening, another Astor uses architecture to dissolve those boundaries, to demonstrate that in the emerging 20th century, social position can be purchased along with a hotel suite, that the elaborate machinery of calling cards and private balls is becoming obsolete, replaced by more commercial and impersonal forms of elite consumption and display. In 1895, construction begins on a vast double mansion at 840-841 Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, far uptown from Caroline's brownstone. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt for Mrs. Astor and her son John Jacob Astor IV. The commission represents both retreat and escalation: retreat from the increasingly commercial Fifth Avenue downtown, where hotels and businesses are replacing private residences, and escalation in the architectural arms race among New York's wealthiest families, each trying to build something more magnificent than their rivals. The new house, completed in 1896, is designed in French Renaissance style, with limestone facades, elaborate ironwork, and interiors decorated by the most fashionable European craftsmen. Contemporary descriptions in Town and Country and other society magazines emphasize the scale and luxury: a ballroom capable of holding 1,200 guests, 3 times the fabled 400, galleries for displaying art, reception rooms of unprecedented grandeur. The house represents Caroline's attempt to maintain supremacy through architectural magnificence, to build something so impressive that her social authority will be reinforced by physical presence. Yet, even as the new palace rises, observers notice that Mrs. Astor's actual influence is waning. Historical accounts suggest her active social leadership peaked around 1891, and by the early 1900s, a younger generation of hostesses, Grace Vanderbilt, Mamie Fish, Tessie Ulrichs, are shaping society through more informal and flamboyant entertainments that depart from Caroline's rigid protocols. The endless calling cards and formal receptions begin to seem old-fashioned. Younger society women prefer dinner parties with clever conversation, theatrical entertainments, even the shocking innovation of mixed swimming parties. At a January ball in 1905, described in society columns as likely her last major entertainment, Caroline receives guests in purple velvet trimmed with sable, wearing the famous Astor diamonds and other jewels that glitter under newly installed electric lighting. She still performs her habitual gesture before taking a gentleman's arm for the formal opening dance, adjusting the tiny pearl buttons at her glove's wrist, ensuring the fit is perfect. But her movements are slower than in previous years, and some guests attend out of nostalgia or duty rather than allegiance, coming to witness what they recognize as the end of an era. The narrator observes that the new house is larger, grander, more theatrically imposing than anything Caroline has presided over before. Its ballroom can hold 3 times the number she and Ward McAllister once declared represented society's natural limit. But behind its carved limestone facades and elaborate iron gates, the woman who spent decades defining society's boundaries now presides over a world already slipping beyond her control, maintained more by memory and respect for past authority than by actual power to enforce social rules on a new generation increasingly indifferent to the old protocols. By late 1906, newspapers begin referring discreetly to Mrs. Astor's declining health and increasing seclusion inside the mansion on 65th Street. Later accounts by family members and social historians describe periods of dementia and confusion. The once formidable social arbiter, now struggling to distinguish past from present, memory from current reality. Visitors during these final years recall finding her standing before a life-size portrait of herself painted by Carolus Duran in her prime, dressed in formal evening attire, greeting guests who exist only in her fading memory. Names from the 1870s and 1880s, people long dead, receptions from decades past replayed in her mind. The scene, described in various memoirs and later biographical accounts, is simultaneously tragic and emblematic. The woman who controlled access to society's most exclusive spaces now presiding over an imaginary ballroom, extending welcome to phantoms, performing her lifelong role of hostess for an audience that has ceased to exist. Her gloved hands still make the familiar gestures, extending in greeting, adjusting fabric at the wrist, but now the movements are disconnected from any external reality, pure performance without purpose. On 30th of October 1908, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor died in her New York mansion at age 78. Her obituary in the New York Times, respectful and substantial, describes her as the leader of New York society for many years, emphasizing her distinguished lineage, Schermerhorn and Van Cortlandt ancestry, and her decades-long reign as the city's premier hostess. The coverage is laudatory but also contains notes of historical distance, treating her as a figure from a vanishing past, representative of Victorian formality giving way to 20th century modernity. In Trinity Church Cemetery, the Astor Cross, a substantial monument later commissioned by her daughter Carrie, marks the family plot where Caroline is interred alongside other Astors. The monument is appropriately grand, befitting the family's wealth and prominence, but it is ultimately just stone marking death, unable to preserve the social power Caroline wielded in life. In archives and museums scattered across New York and beyond, small artifacts survive from her reign. Calling cards with her name engraved in elegant script, invitations to balls and receptions, photographs of crowded ballrooms where women in elaborate gowns and men in formal dress perform the rituals Caroline enforced. The actual gloves she wore, the visiting book where she recorded her judgments, the fountain pen she used to add or omit names from guest lists, these personal objects are lost, discarded, or unidentified in collections. What remains are the documentary traces, names on paper, dates of social events, and the historical memory of a ballroom that could hold at most 400 carefully selected souls. The narrator observes that Caroline Astor's story concludes not with triumph but with transformation, her absolute authority dissolved by time, illness, and changing social norms. The woman who spent decades deciding who belonged now belongs herself only to history, her power to include or exclude reduced to archival record, her elaborate social architecture dismantled by forces she could neither control nor prevent. The documentary's closing image does not show Caroline's grand mansion on 65th Street or the ballroom where she once presided. Instead, the camera lingers on a museum display case, glass protecting artifacts from the touch of modern viewers. Inside lies a single white calling card, the engraving still crisp despite over a century passing. Mrs. Astor. Nothing more is needed. The definite article and surname alone conveyed everything necessary in her world. Around the card, only archival silence. The card itself is an object of curiosity now, a relic of customs that contemporary viewers must have explained to them, evidence of social rituals that seem quaint or incomprehensible to 21st century democracy. Museum placards describe the calling card system, explain how the Victorian elite used these small pieces of pasteboard to maintain social networks and enforce hierarchies, and contextualize Caroline Astor's role in Gilded Age New York society. But the card itself remains mute, unable to convey what it meant when delivered by footmen to Fifth Avenue doorsteps. Validation or rejection, inclusion or exile, social existence or invisibility. The gesture of a gloved hand that once decided who might enter a drawing room is now frozen as a museum artifact, elegance and exclusion preserved under glass but no longer obeyed, no longer feared, no longer powerful. Other cases nearby contain additional ephemera from Caroline's era. Elaborate ball gowns demonstrating the period's fashions, photographs of Newport cottages and Fifth Avenue mansions, guest lists and menu cards from famous entertainments. Together, they reconstruct a vanished world of formality and hierarchy, of families whose names dominated society columns and whose approval mattered intensely to those seeking social position. But it is a dead world, preserved only in archives and museum collections, its protocols obsolete and its certainties about who belonged and who didn't now seeming arbitrary rather than natural. The narrator's final reflection: Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor spent 78 years, and particularly the central decades of her adult life, building and maintaining an architecture of social power. She used calling cards and guest lists, ballrooms and drawing rooms, the elaborate machinery of Victorian etiquette to sort and rank New York's wealthy families, determining who belonged to society and who remained outside despite their money. Her judgments shaped lives, directed marriages, created opportunities for those she approved, and closed doors for those she excluded. But architecture, whether social or physical, cannot resist forever the forces that seek to reshape it. New money kept arriving, building bigger houses, throwing more lavish parties, demanding recognition. Younger generations rejected the old protocols as stuffy and obsolete. The commercial world of hotels and restaurants began offering public versions of the exclusive experiences Caroline's ballroom had provided privately. And finally, inevitably, time and illness claimed the woman at the center of the system, leaving behind only her name on a card in a museum case. The gloves Caroline Astor once adjusted, that small, repeated gesture captured in the opening scene and echoed throughout her life, are gone, destroyed, or lost, or unrecognizable among uncatalogued museum holdings. But the gesture itself endures in historical memory. The small motion that could include or exclude, that wielded power through refinement, that made visible the hidden costs of privilege. In that preserved calling card, in that gesture of adjustment and control, lies both the beauty of Caroline Astor's world and the constraint it imposed, elegance inseparable from exclusion, grace that required others' exile,